Germany because Luther was, again, very popular among his people, among poorer class people, among people who would be considered, you might say, nationalists. They liked Luther quite a bit. Um, you might say, like within 10 years after the Diet, several things happened, and it wasn't just in Germany. It was surrounding Germany as well. So some of the changes that began to happen after Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other, God help me," and then he left. You know, he went to Warburg Castle. You know, he translated the Bible, the New Testament, into German. One of the things that began to change was people began to preach differently. People began to preach justification by faith alone, as in other churches. They began to preach a different gospel, Luther's gospel, which is in fact just the gospel. Confidence in the Virgin Mary began to dwindle as well. So let me explain a little bit about this. Now, Luther and Calvin, and I think there was a footnote here I read earlier, maybe Zwingli. Let me see the names. Yeah, Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin all struggled with Mariology. Like Mary was up here. Okay, Mary was important. And there was a doctrine surrounding Mary about her, and it was the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Mary was seen as sinless. And that was a hard doctrine, a hard pill to swallow, to get rid of the idea that Mary wasn't sinless. She actually was a sinner, was a difficult thing for Luther to accept. In fact, he was kind of believing in Mary until, he died. Up to a certain point, the footnote here in this book says that he believed she was sinless sinless after the conception of Jesus. Like, she may have sinned before the conception, but after she conceived Jesus, she was sinless. Now, they're wrestling probably with the idea, well, if Mary was sinful, why wasn't Jesus born with guilt and Adam's original stain of sin, and so on and so forth. But the Catholic Church held to the Immaculate Conception of Mary. They held to Mary's intercession for the saints. And so, even though the Reformation is in swing, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, they all still kind of held on to some Catholic doctrines for the rest of their life, as you can probably imagine. This isn't like something it's not like a switch. You just flick and then all of a sudden all my doctrines change. It's a process. So, but nonetheless, the Virgin Mary and the saints ceased to have a place in worship. There was a change in worship services. So preaching was different. Mary worship and saint worship was different. Crucially, the language changed. So the content of the preaching changed, the people and the objects of worship changed, and the language changed. So the language went, of course, from Latin to German. Now we can have songs in German. We can have prayer in German. And this is in Germany, of course, but they got rid of the Latin. Nobody could understand it. So this is a big deal. Before this, people would come into worship to observe. They would watch. And they would feel the sense of adoration as they watched the holy things take place. But it wasn't a participant style of worship. That's what changed. People started participating in worship in their own language. They started praying. Even in Mass. Mass began to be given to the laity. And it wasn't just once a year. If you remember this, Catholics would only give the laity Mass once a year. You take the drink, take the bread once a year. And they would typically, place the wafer or whatever, bread or whatever in your mouth, the priest would, and offer you the cup. But now they're starting to offer it regularly to the laity. And so there was a vocal participation. There was a kind of a communion presentation that took place, or participation that took place in worship. Why did they do this? Why is it that they don't need to watch the priest offer the body and the blood? Why do they no longer need to just watch the priest or listen to the priest recite the Lord's Prayer or recite the Apostles' Creed and so on and so forth? Why is it that now they can participate? It's because Luther preached that all believers are priests. All believers are priests. It's not just one person up front. There's the priesthood of all believers. And so you can defend this from 1 Peter chapter, I don't know, like 2 or 3, something like this, where it's very clearly stated. And so, therefore, since you're a priest, you can partake of the meal. They began to, and this is big, and this is still tied to the priesthood of all believers, they could elect their own pastors, which was a huge deal. Before, you had a lot of corruption surrounding this, and I will tell you this, the corruption didn't cease. Okay, the corruption didn't cease. I'll explain how the corruption kept going on in a minute. But they could elect their own pastors. Like this congregation here, you can choose as a congregation to elect me to be your pastor. You can choose to let me go at any moment. It's solely in the authority is within the congregation itself. Okay? For Catholics, you would have people that were way up close to the Pope or maybe the Pope himself designating which archbishop is going to serve where, which bishop is going to serve where, and who it's going to be. And, there's possibly maybe a little, trading of money going on here so that they can buy and sell church positions where they want. But now, because all believers are priests, they can choose their own bishops. But this is where it gets a little tricky. The German church, all of a sudden, it was Catholic, but now it's not. It's starting to kind of reject the papacy, reject the Catholic structure. Well, that left kind of a vacuum in the organization of the church. All of a sudden, like it or not, the Roman Catholic Church was very well organized. It had a tiered structure. It had a set system. The money went to the same place, and people were in charge, and it was a well-oiled machine, right? But now you have churches that are trying to get organized for themselves, and so there needs to be some structural things put in place. So, in the interest of peace and harmony, Luther advocated, and I'll explain why he did this in a second, but just take this for what it is, okay? Luther advocated that secular rulers, princes, council members, city council, can act as, quote, emergency bishops to oversee church matters. Now, why would he do something like that? Well, he saw you have a position within the city of political power and influence, so that's good. You can get things done. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. But in this time, people were seen as, most people were seen as Christian, like you would identify with the Christian church. So the prince or the city council, whoever it is, would have been, at least by name, by confession, a Christian, and may have truly been a Christian, and this may have been a good system that worked. Because if you think about it, you have a city council member or a leader in the town, they know how the town works, and they can actually meet needs very well. But, as you can imagine, they began to use their position of political power. If they didn't want to use it to reform the church, they began to use it to increase their power. So now you begin to have, and Luther wanted this. Luther said, these emergency bishops can appoint a pastor and put them in place and then kind of get out of the situation. They could. Make sure their houses are paid for, make sure that their needs are met, and so on and so forth, that they can focus entirely on the church. But as you can imagine, some of these emergency bishops wanted to keep that position, and they wanted to exploit that position so that they could increase their power. And so one of the problems was greed. You had these emergency bishops who were also political leaders that began to get power hungry. They were greedy again. It's not the Catholic Church, but it's very similar. in some ways to what the Catholic Church was doing. Now, it wasn't like this all over the place. I'm just telling you how it happened. So there was a development. The idea of church and state division, I don't think was happening at this time. Like, that's new. They still understood there was a German national church, and it was very much linked to the state. So for centuries, the idea that the church and the state were seen as one kind of unit was just an accepted thing. Just because they're getting away from the Catholic Church doesn't mean now church and state are different at all. In fact, the state now may even take a more dominant role in running the church. Okay? So in Luther's mind, this acceptance of the, quote, emergency bishop status by the princes and the magistrates was supposed to be a temporary measure until the Reformation was secure and settled into what it was going to be. So within this time period, you also see Luther criticizing, of course, the Catholic Church, but also monasticism. Luther obviously he believed in it at first. He was a part of the Augustinian order, and they were committed to lifelong celibacy. But Luther speaks against that heavily, and not just speaks against it. He begins to kind of detest the idea of celibacy altogether. And I'll tell you about his marriage in just a minute. He married a woman named Katharina von Bora. There is a biography, I think, that has recently come out about that woman's life, if you're interested in reading it. I don't know a lot about her, but the impression that I have of what I do know of her is that she was every bit as hardworking as Martin Luther, like a very tenacious woman, and must have been to take care of, I think, 6 children most of the time by herself and run like this huge house. I've seen a picture of the house. It was a very long house. People would come and stay at the house often with Luther, and they would kind of use it as I guess like a hub, you might say. So he spoke against the idea of monasticism and the idea of if you want to live a holier life, you had to be a monk. That was like, no. We're done with that form of thinking. In fact, he said that the ordinary life of a husband, a father, or a mother was holier than monastic life. And I actually could see that. Like, I can say that as a husband, as a father, and so on and so forth, married life and parenting comes with its own measure of suffering and sacrifices that you must learn to do, and especially raising children. When you do that, you're committing to shepherding hearts, and that can be extremely difficult and very sanctifying. But anyway, let me talk about Katharina von Bora. Luther, after abandoning the monastic life, married a young ex-nun, and that was Katharina von Bora. Her years are 1499 to 1552. He was 42 years old when he married. Katharina was 26. So, a little difference there in age. What is that, my math people? 42 to 26, 16? Is that right? 16 years older? Age is just a number, right? So, Roman Catholic enemies said this. This is interesting. They darkly prophesied that the Antichrist was sure to be born of an unholy union between a monk and a nun. And I think that's kind of funny if you think about that. Because Luther's calling the papacy, I'm so glad right? He says, I'm so glad to know that the Pope is the Antichrist. But now the Roman Catholics are saying, if there's whatever Antichrist it is, it's going to be born. It's going to be the spawn of a monk and a nun. So evangelicals mockingly replied, if sexual intercourse between a monk and a nun would give birth to the Antichrist, then several thousand Antichrists have already been born in the Middle Ages. So, in fact, Luther's marriage to Katharina proved to be very happy. It was holy. It was full of humor. Luther referred to her as my Lord Katie, probably something like little L. It's a way of showing honor. Speaking from his own experience, Luther's verdict on the married life and on Katie was positive. Hear him quote this. It said, "Next to God's word, there is no more precious treasure than the holy ordinance of marriage. God's highest earthly gift is a spiritually minded, cheerful, God-fearing, home-keeping wife with whom you can live in peace and whom you can trust with your property, your body, and your life." That's just a nice thing to say. I love that. That's good. He had a high view of marriage, had a high view, Luther, of music and I should say joy. I would imagine Luther was a very joyful person, even though he had or many enemies, rather. So Luther and Katie went on to raise 6 kids. Luther's example held up a new form of religious and social life in the Western world for people to copy. So other clergymen, Protestant clergymen, now started to say, hey, I want to get married, and I want to raise a family. And so you have other clergymen follow his lead and imitate him and make their own families. So one of the things that followed 10 years after, if you will, after the Reformation, was a heavy emphasis on family life, on having a spouse and having children and raising them. That was not the norm in Roman Catholic theology, because in the Roman Catholic theology, it was the celibate life that was seen as holier, and that was something that was defeated by Luther. There was a fresh appreciation of marriage and family life. Okay.
And she made real good homemade beer.
And she made apparently really, really good beer. That's another thing that obviously she was a hardworking person. He would write letters, can't wait to get home and taste some of the homemade beer. I know I've shared this story, but he was going to preach on, Noah being drunk or whatever, and he was drinking, and he said, well, I better drink up to really get into the mindset. And this was like the night before he was going to preach. So, he was German. Germans drink. Okay. Even though there were some good things happening with the Reformation, as you can imagine, the pendulum swings, doesn't it? It goes from one end to the other. So like St. Augustine, when he was radically converted, he had his mistress over here, had a child before he was converted, and named him Adeodatus, which simply means given from God. Even though he was not a believer, he named him that. When he became converted, the pendulum swung all the way over to the opposite side, right? He sent her away, and he never married again. And it was kind of a sad thing, right? But he had a view of marriage that was not positive because in his sinful life, right, he just didn't do it right, okay? So he went too far with that. And possibly the view of Augustine maybe got adopted into the Catholic Church. We don't know the source there, but there was also a pendulum swinging with the Reformation. People began to take in Martin Luther's preaching and his teaching and his new form of church polity, and they went too far and became very radical. So I'm going to throw out some names. I'll throw out two names and a term. One was Karl Stott. I think that you've heard of Karl Stott before. He was a friend of Luther, a follower of Luther. He respected Luther greatly. Another one was Zwilling or Zwilling. And then the last group of guys, traveling preachers known as the Zwickau prophets. And I'll explain them here in just a minute. But Karl Stott and Zwilling, they spearheaded a Reformation in Wittenberg, following Luther's denunciation of the Catholic Church. And so what did they start doing? They started to attack images of Christ. So when they would find images of Christ on a cross, on a necklace, or something like that in the church, tear them down. Why? Because thou shalt not make any graven image before thee, right? So this is iconoclasm. They're getting rid of the icons, getting rid of any of the images of Christ and the saints. They got rid of instrumental music in worship, so they're getting rid of the guitar. I can tell you what, Luther wouldn't like that. Luther loved music. I can't quote him, but there was one quote I read by Luther one time where he said, if there was a religion that was based entirely on music, I would be tempted to give into it, or something like that. He just loved music. A mighty fortress is our God. You know this song? A mighty fortress is our God. Oh, boom, dum, 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 dum. I think it was a bar song that he turned into a hymn. I'm pretty sure that he took a bar song and said, you know what? I like that tune. Let's just baptize it. And so here we are. We sing. I could be wrong about that, but that's how I've been taught. Luther loved music. These guys are getting rid of instrumental music in worship. They're getting rid of offering wine as well as the bread to the laity in communion. They're trying to force lay people. They're trying to force lay people to touch and handle the bread because Christ has said, take and eat. Now, there's a lot of debate about how communion should be done between Martin Luther and some other reformers. Luther he believed what he believed, and he parted ways with people I don't think he should have parted ways with, and it was typically over communion. But there was a traveling group, actually let me back up, Karlstadt. He took a wife. He wanted to compel all the clergy to follow his example, and he denounced celibacy as a positive evil. So notice the pendulum swing, okay? Luther's taking a wife and having a family. I'm going to take a wife and have a family. You all need to do this or you're in sin. You see what I'm saying? Which is not biblical. There is such a thing as the gift of singleness. That is a real thing. Not everyone has it. Probably most people don't. But it's a real thing. So, but he's denouncing celibacy as a positive evil. Things started to spin completely out of control when 3 preachers south of Wittenberg from a place called Zwickau arrived in the city in December 1521. These 3 guys were Nicholas Storch, Marcus Stubner, and Thomas Dreschel. Now, what's important about they claimed, and this I can already I know you're going to relate to this. All right, they claimed to be in direct contact with God, who they said spoke to them in private revelations. Oh, here we go. Right, direct contact with God, spoke in private revelations. Who's done that before? Muhammad, the Mormons, and most other weirdos. Okay? This, when they're saying this, when they mean is they're saying like, they're not saying God has impressed this upon my heart. That's a different thing. I would say that. I would say that God moves us in certain ways to minister to certain people. And most of the time when God impresses something on my heart, it's usually he brings a scripture to mind that's right for that moment. You know what I mean? Or one of you say something to me and you don't know about my struggle, and it just so happens like I needed to hear that. And you quote a scripture, and I take that as straight from the Lord because it is scripture, right? That's different. This is special private revelations, which we actually have today still, where you have this direct line with God according to some people today. They're claiming this. That God told me this, to say this. So these became labeled, Luther called them the Zwickau prophets. So they opposed, okay? Now, I know you might oppose this, but Luther I don't think did. They opposed infant baptism and perhaps all water baptism, which is weird. They proclaimed that the end of the world would shortly take place. Oh, we've heard this too. I remember a guy, since I've been alive, he was sold on this. He said it's going to happen on this day, and people sold all their stuff and everything, you know, and it didn't happen. And I remember watching a video. Oh, yeah. They go up to the guy, opens the door. Hey, it's like the day after, you know. What happened? Yeah, and I remember the guy answering. He's like, just shuts the door. I can't talk right now. But anyway, it would take place. Karlstadt and Zwilling sided with the Zwickau prophets. So historians call them radicals because they departed from Catholicism of the Middle Ages much more radically, of course, than the reformers did. And the reformers split, you might say, as church historians have said, into two different groups. One they called the magisterial reformers, which I think Luther would have been a part of that train, maybe a little more Catholic there. And then the other one was just more radical, the radical reformers. Now the radicals, they just keep doing this. They just keep getting more and more. They split here and split here and split there because they have so many different views on certain things. So these different groups had different views. The twofold distinction between magisterial and radical reformers was widely accepted by historians, but it does an injustice to the nature of the so-called magisterial Reformation. In terms of church-state relations, there were three distinct streams of the Reformation in the 16th century. So what you're seeing is the Reformation's happening, but it's not one course. Okay, you're seeing the radicals do this, and then you're seeing the magisterial also do this. They have different views of how the church and state should function together. So there were the nationalist reformers, and they transferred, this is key, the nationalist reformers transferred the power of the papacy to the state. That is the king, the prince, and the parliament, and the city council. They wanted to secure protection for themselves against the papacy, against the pope. So they said, okay, power's now going to the state. So they had this idea of an ideal medieval Christian society, and in order to have that, we gotta have the princes on board. Two, there were reformers that remained committed of Christianizing society and culture. They believed in the rightness of a Christian state, but insisted that the institutional church must be independent of state control. So the first one said, we need to transfer power over to the state. The second one said, no, we believe in the state, but we think that the church should have control of itself. By the way, this is kind of the avenue where you find Baptists. We believe in autonomous churches. We function not under the control of the state. We function not under the control of the SBC or under the control of any other church. It's entirely autonomous. So then there are those reformers who abandoned the idea of a Christian society or culture altogether and saw the church as an alternate society, living in the midst of an irredeemable, wicked, and hostile world. So these were the radical reformers. So they would say, well, you can't really redeem the society and the culture. The church is the only place where you're going to see this kind of redemption and reformation take place. Now, where would I fall? I would fall with the third, actually. The church is the place where you're actually going to find actual reformation, but I would lean into the second. I would say, well, let's try to reform society as best we can. Let's get elected to city council positions and so on and so forth. We have one over here. Yeah. No, you're not going to do that? Okay. No, not that. Not even close. Don't even start there. I'm not that, nor am I a Christian nationalist. Okay? But I do think it's good that we have people that are invested and involved in the good of society. Where do I get that? I get it from the Bible, where it says, while they were in Babylon, God said to them, seek the good of the city. I mean, they're in exile, but seek the good of the city. Okay? Don't expect the city to stop being Babylon. I think that's the difference between me and Christian nationalism. They'll think Babylon's no longer Babylon. It's going to be Babylon until Jesus returns. So, all right. Under the influence of these three people, Karl Stott, Zwilling, and the Zwickau prophets, the religious life of Wittenberg became extremely chaotic. Violence erupted. Mobs began to go around smashing altars, shrines, images, getting rid of the statues, getting rid of the stained glass. Now you remember the stained glass, it depicted Christ and the saints. It would also depict stories, of the Gospels and so on and so forth. And that was important because people couldn't read. And so they could point to these things possibly and retell a story. People could come in and they could be reminded of the story. But they're smashing it, no images. So it began to get a little bit more intense, and it eventually manifested in what's called the Peasants' Revolt. I'm skipping ahead just a little bit for time's sake, but Germany's vast peasant population had suffered increasing social and economic hardships. Violent uprisings began to happen in southern Germany in the years of 1493, 1501, 1512, 1514, and 1517. But they were overpowered each time by the princes and the nobles. There was, in June of 1524, however, there was an armed peasant uprising that broke out, and let me see if I can say this, Stulingen, near the Swiss city of Schaffhausen. Oh, that was pretty close. It was a spark which lit a fire of a revolt that eventually blazed across all of Germany, known as historians call it, the Peasants' Revolt. It also included the working classes of towns and cities. The Peasants' Revolt was of 1524 to 1525, and it was twofold. One, the Peasants' Revolt was more widespread, engulfing the whole of Germany, north as well as south. So it was all across the country. Two, like they had had little revolts up to this point, but now it's countrywide, okay? Two, now it has a religious inspiration from the Reformation. So you may have peasants revolting before, but now they're adopting Lutheranism, if you can call it that. Luther hated that term, but they're adopting Lutheranism. They're adopting Lutheran doctrine. They're crying out, a single name, as it says, Luther. Luther. They saw Luther as their patron saint, if you want to say it that way. So they're having a radical. Luther's theology is having radical. Why would it have an influence on the peasants? Well, because now there's been kind of an uplifting of the peasants. You can participate in worship. You can have regular communion. You have, if you will, a voice. Not just a voice in worship, but their voice is being heard. And you are also, even though you're a peasant, you are a priest. You see? So they have a voice now. The radicals played a prominent role in this, especially a man named Thomas Müntzer. Was a leader in the Peasants' Revolt. There were social and political demands, included things like returning to common ownership of the forests and the meadows, which had been taken over by the nobles. They wanted ownership as well. They wanted an end to being forced to work for the nobility without pay. Creation of better welfare service to take care of the poor, and they proposed that all their demands should be tested against the Word of God, and if any were found to be unscriptural, then they proposed to withdraw them. I believe, now I don't have the numbers here. I'll tell you a couple of things. Luther did not like this peasants' revolt. I'll tell you this. He sided with the nobles, actually, and the princes. The peasants' revolt, I think, I'm looking for, Here's a statistic for you. November 1525, the German princes crushed all resistance to their rule in a storm of bloodshed. He says it was a foretaste of hell. The troops massacred the poorly armed peasant armies, around 100,000 peasants killed, massacred, lost their lives, leaving their wives and children completely destitute. So the Peasants' Revolt, as you can imagine, had a deep and lasting impact on the Reformation. It marked the end of the rapid spread of Lutheranism in Germany. Luther's brutal attitude in the revolt alienated many of the lower classes. A significant number of them turned from Lutheranism to the various forms of the radical Reformation. I think some also probably went back to Catholicism. So this peasants' revolt, it's not like it helped the cause, you might say, of Lutheranism. In fact, it put the brakes on Lutheranism spreading and on the Reformation in general. Okay. And the last thing I should say that the Peasants' Revolt did is that it made the princes tighten the reins on the Reformation. So 100,000 people die in your country, and they're claiming a name Luther, and it's the spread of the Reformation, and Luther opposes them, and there's all this political stuff going on. What are the princes going to do? We're going to contain this situation. We're going to try to control the spread of the Reformation and make it more manageable. Okay, so what ended up happening is their status as emergency bishops became permanent. Now we can control. So remember, they were given that emergency status. Now they can control the spread of the Reformation. Okay. Luther's attitude toward the radicals is that they should basically be silenced and banished. Pendulum swung too far, and he wanted to bring it back. All right, I'm going to pause there, see if you guys have any questions or comments, because next time I'm going to jump ahead and start talking about probably Zwingli and the Swiss Reformation, and then I'll jump ahead to Calvin. Those will be the last two names we cover. We have Zwingli and then we have Calvin. Any comments or questions? He was kind of like the forerunner for Anabaptists. So there was a movement, I guess I should say this, there was a movement of people that developed out of the Reformation, and they were called Anabaptists. And Anabaptist simply means re-baptizer. Anna is again. So baptizing again. Baptists probably come from Anabaptists, though they broke off. Okay, so Anabaptist means the rebaptizers. They would rebaptize people because they thought, well, either their Catholic baptism was not good, but their infant baptism was surely not good. So we want to baptize and dunk them down, typically underneath the water and all the way back up. And so there was a lot of turmoil and heat surrounding them. They were seen as radical. Luther opposed them. He would not have been at all okay with the Anabaptist movement. The idea of infant baptism, in his mind, still was okay and still had sway. And to be fair, I don't judge Luther for that or anybody else at that time for holding that infant baptism was the right way to go, because it had been for 1,100 years, ever since Augustine. Really, it sealed the deal for so long. How would you argue against something like that? So I can understand that. To re-baptize someone was seen to be kind of an odd thing, and it is. It's kind of an odd thing, but sometimes people are in our theology, right? Sometimes people are baptized too soon, and then they're converted afterwards, and they want to be rebaptized. And I think in that situation, that's okay. Your baptism wants to follow your conversion, right? They didn't have that kind of mindset of baptism following conversion. Which, by the way, if this is okay, we will have a baptism next Sunday night for Caleb Robertson. But we will also have one for Kiri as well, his wife, because she is convinced, and she told me, we've talked about this, counseled her through this, but she's convinced that she was converted after her baptism when she was very young. And so she has voiced her desire to profess her faith through baptism as a believer who's been born again. So both will be baptized on Sunday. I talked to you about that a little bit, but she kind of confirmed it. You haven't heard that, but it happened very quickly. We can talk more about it. It just happened today. So it's an exciting thing. All right. Any other things, comments, questions? If that's it, then Drake, can you cut that